The shuttle docked with a heavy clang that echoed through the metal walls, and Alara Vance grabbed her single bag as the airlock hissed open before her. She stepped onto Nexus Station 7 for the first time, her boots hitting the deck plating with a soft thud that nobody noticed or cared about. She was just another body arriving on the edge of contested space, another warm soul to fill a position that nobody else wanted to take. The station stretched out around her like a maze of corridors and flashing lights and alien languages she could barely understand. And she followed the glowing directional signs toward the medical wing while trying not to bump into the dozens of species that rushed past her without a second glance. Alara was 22 years old and fresh out of Earth's Frontier Medical Corps training program, and she had graduated at the very bottom of her class. Not because she was stupid or lazy, but because the written exams had made her freeze up every single time, her mind going blank under the pressure of ticking clocks and proctors watching her every move. Her practical skills were solid enough. Her instructors had admitted that much. She could handle trauma cases and keep calm when blood was spraying and patients were screaming, but put a test paper in front of her and she became useless. That was why they had sent her here, to the station that served as a dumping ground for failures and misfits and people the Corps wanted to forget about. She found the emergency ward at the end of a long corridor, pushed through the double doors, and immediately felt every eye in the room turn toward her with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright contempt. The air was chaos in motion. Beds lined the walls, holding patients of species she had only seen in training videos, their bodies ranging from humanoid to something that looked like a walking crystal formation, to a massive creature covered in dark green scales that took up 3 beds, pushed together. A 4-armed figure approached her with heavy footsteps, and Alara had to crane her neck to look up at the Torvaxian, who stood nearly 6 feet tall with a face like carved stone and eyes that held no warmth whatsoever. "You are the new human," the Torvaxian said in a voice that rumbled like distant thunder. And it was not a question, but a statement of fact delivered with obvious disappointment. "Yes, I am Alara Vance, reporting for duty as assigned," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady, even though her heart was pounding against her ribs. "I am Head Nurse Torvin, and you will address me as such," the Torvaxian said while looking down at her like she was an insect that had crawled onto the floor. "I did not request a human for this posting, and I do not expect you to be useful, but you will follow my orders and stay out of the way when real work needs to be done." Alara nodded and said nothing because she had learned that arguing with superiors never made anything better. Torvin led her through the ward with quick steps that she struggled to match, pointing out the supply closets and the trauma bays and the quarantine section for species with contagious conditions. "Do not touch the Kethvari patients unless absolutely necessary," Torvin warned as they passed a large scaled creature she had noticed earlier. "They do not like being handled by prey species, and they can break your spine with one arm if you offend them." Alara looked at the sleeping Kethvari and felt a chill run down her back. The creature was enormous, easily 7 feet long even while curled on its side, with 4 muscular arms and a face full of tusks that looked sharp enough to tear through metal. "Understood," she said quietly. They reached a small office at the back of the ward where an elderly alien sat behind a cluttered desk, his skin a pale blue and his eyes large and watery like pools of milk. This was Dr. Pelion, the chief physician of the emergency ward, and he looked up at Alara with an expression of tired resignation. "Another human," he said, with a sigh that seemed to come from deep within his frail chest. "The Corps keeps sending them to us as if we are a training facility for their rejects." "I will do my best to be useful, Doctor," Alara said. "Your best will not be enough," Dr. Pelion replied while waving one thin hand dismissively. "Humans are fragile and slow and lack the natural abilities that other species possess. But I suppose we must work with what we are given." Alara felt heat rise to her cheeks, but but she bit her tongue and nodded again. The first week was exactly as bad as she had expected it would be. She was given the worst tasks, the ones that nobody else wanted, like cleaning up after patients who had multiple digestive systems or restocking supplies in storage rooms that were barely lit. The other staff members ignored her when she tried to speak to them, walking past her as if she were invisible. And she ate her meals alone in the corner of the cafeteria while watching the other species, gathering groups that laughed and talked in languages she could not understand. At night, she lay in her tiny quarters and stared at the ceiling and wondered why she had ever thought she could make a difference out here among the stars. She could make a difference out here among the stars. But she did not quit, because quitting was not something that humans did easily. Her grandmother had always told her that humans were stubborn creatures who survived through sheer refusal to give up. And Alara held on to those words like a lifeline in the dark. 3 weeks passed in a blur of exhaustion and loneliness, and she learned the rhythms of the station and the patterns of the patients and the moods of her colleagues who still treated her like furniture. She learned which species needed cold environments and which ones needed heat, which ones had blood that was toxic to touch, and which ones could regenerate limbs if you gave them enough time. She learned to move quickly and quietly, and to anticipate what the doctors needed before they asked for it. And slowly, very slowly, the contempt in their eyes began to fade into something closer to tolerance. It was not respect, not yet, but it was enough to keep her going. And then the patrol vessel arrived with wounded soldiers from a battle in the outer sectors, and everything changed in ways that Alara could never have predicted. The alarms began to wail through the corridors, red lights flashing everywhere, and Torvin's voice boomed through the speakers, ordering all staff to prepare for mass casualties. Alara grabbed her emergency kit and ran toward the trauma base with her heart pounding and her hands steady, ready to prove that she was more than just another human reject. She had no idea that the next few hours would change her life forever and send ripples across a dozen star systems. The first stretchers came through the doors like a flood of broken bodies, and Alara jumped into action alongside the rest of the staff as the emergency ward transformed into a battlefield of its own. Soldiers of a dozen different species lay bleeding and groaning, their wounds ranging from burns to deep gashes to injuries she could not even identify because the anatomy was so alien to her. She moved between the beds with practiced efficiency, applying pressure bandages and checking vital signs and calling out status reports to Torvin, who directed traffic like a general commanding troops. The chaos was overwhelming, but Alara found herself strangely calm in the middle of it. This was what she had trained for. This was where her skills actually meant something, and her hands moved without hesitation, even when her mind was racing to keep up. An hour passed, then 2, and the flood of casualties began to slow as the most critical patients were stabilized, and the less urgent cases were moved to secondary care areas. Alara was wiping blood from her hands when she heard Torvin call her name with unusual urgency. "Human, get to Trauma Bay 3 immediately," the head nurse commanded. "Dr. Pellion needs assistance with a difficult patient." She ran down the corridor and pushed through the doors to find a scene that made her blood run cold. On the table lay the largest Kethvari she had ever seen. A massive wall of scaled muscle and coiled power that dwarfed even the other members of his species. His dark green hide was marked with scars that spoke of countless battles, and his forearms were thick enough to crush stone. Dr. Pellion stood beside him with surgical tools in his trembling hands, his pale blue face even paler than usual. "This is Commander Varath Kesson," the doctor explained in a voice that shook slightly. "He has shrapnel embedded in his thorax from an explosion, and we must remove it before the fragments reach his secondary heart." Alara looked at the commander and felt a primal fear stir in her chest. His 3 amber eyes were fixed on the ceiling, and his jaw was clenched tight against what must have been incredible pain. "Why has he not been sedated?" she asked, Because he refuses, Dr. Pelion replied with frustration clear in his voice. The Kethvari are proud warriors, and they consider sedation to be a form of weakness, especially for one of his rank and reputation. Commander Vorath turned his massive head toward Alara, and she felt the weight of his gaze like a physical pressure against her skin. "I do not yield to pain," he growled in a voice like grinding rocks. "I have fought in 37 campaigns, and I have never once allowed chemicals to cloud my mind, and I will not start now. Commander, the procedure will be extremely painful without sedation," Alara tried to explain. "Pain is nothing," Vorath replied with contempt dripping from every word. "Pain is just the body screaming like a coward, and I have learned to ignore cowards." Dr. Pelion gave Alara a helpless look and then picked up his surgical probe with hands that were visibly shaking. "Hold him as steady as you can," the doctor instructed. "We must work quickly." Alara positioned herself near the commander's upper body and placed her hands on his shoulders, knowing that her strength meant nothing against a creature that could tear her apart without effort. The doctor began to probe the wound, searching for the shrapnel fragments, and Commander Vorath's muscles tensed beneath Alara's palms. A low growl rumbled from his chest, growing louder as the doctor worked deeper into the wound. "Almost there," Dr. Pelion muttered. "Just a little more and I can—" He touched something sensitive, and Commander Vorath's entire body convulsed with a roar of agony that shook the walls. Alara saw something terrible happen in that moment. The commander's 3 amber eyes flickered and then turned completely black, as if the light behind them had been extinguished. His muscles went rigid, his breathing became rapid and shallow, and a sound emerged from his throat that was not a voice, but something older and more primal. A sound that spoke of ancient hunting grounds and prey that needed to be destroyed. "Get back!" Dr. Pelion screamed as he stumbled away from the table. "He has entered the berserker state." Alara had read about this in her training, but she had never expected to witness it in person. The Kethvari berserker state was a survival mechanism buried deep in their biology, a response to extreme pain or threat that shut down all higher reasoning and left nothing but pure violent instinct. Commander Vorath surged off the table with a speed that should have been impossible for something so large, his forearm sweeping out and catching Dr. Pelion across the chest. The elderly physician flew through the air and crashed into a medical cabinet with a sickening crunch. Alarms began to wail as the station's security systems detected the violence, but Alara knew that help would not arrive in time. Security was stationed on the other side of the ward, and they were at least 6 minutes away. Commander Vorath swept his arm across a tray of surgical instruments, sending them flying like deadly projectiles. And then he turned toward the door that led to the main ward where dozens of helpless patients lay in their beds. His black eye saw no allies, no colleagues, no innocent bystanders. They saw only threats to be eliminated, only prey to be hunted and destroyed. Torvin appeared in the doorway and froze at the sight of the berserker commander, all 4 of her arms raised in a gesture of surrender that meant nothing to the creature that Vorath had become. "Everyone stay back," Torvin shouted. "Do not engage him, do not make eye contact, just—" But it was too late because Vorath had already locked onto her as his next target. He charged forward with thundering steps that cracked the floor plating beneath his weight, and Torvin dove to the side, just barely avoiding the massive fist that would have crushed her skull. Alara stood in the middle of the trauma bay with her heart pounding and her mind racing through every option she could think of. She could run, she could hide, she could wait for security and hope they arrived before anyone died. But then she thought about the patients in the main ward, the wounded soldiers who could not move, the staff members who were scattered and defenseless. If Vorath reached them, people would die. Something shifted inside Alara in that moment, something that came from a place deeper than thought or training or fear. It was something old, something inherited from countless generations of ancestors who had faced predators and survived, who had looked into the eyes of death and refused to look away. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory, words from a dojo back on Earth where he had taught her things that she thought she would never need to use. "Sometimes the only way out is through," he had said with a smile that carried wisdom earned through decades of experience. "And sometimes the smallest warrior can topple the mightiest giant." Alara took a deep breath, set her feet, and prepared to do something that everyone watching would later call either incredibly brave or completely insane. Commander Vorath turned his massive head toward Alara, and his black eyes locked onto her small form with the cold focus of a predator that had found easier prey. She was tiny compared to him, barely reaching his chest even if she stood on her toes. She weighed perhaps a third of what he did, and her soft human body had no scales or claws or natural weapons of any kind. To every alien in that room, she must have looked like a sacrifice walking willingly toward the altar. But something was happening inside Alara that she could not fully explain or understand, a transformation that seemed to bypass her conscious mind and speak directly to her muscles and bones. Her grandfather had called it the old brain, the part of human neurology that remembered things the rest of the mind had forgotten. It remembered how to track prey across endless savannas, how to read the movement of predators before they struck, how to find the weakness in something larger and faster and more dangerous. Humans had evolved on a planet that tried to kill them in 1,000 different ways. Ice ages had frozen them, predators had hunted them, diseases had ravaged them, and through it all they had survived through sheer stubborn refusal to die. They had developed pattern recognition that could predict the trajectory of a thrown spear or the charge of a hungry lion. They had developed proprioception that allowed them to know exactly where their bodies were in space at every moment. They had developed the ability to see weakness and exploit leverage against opponents that should have been impossible to defeat. 60,000 years of unbroken warfare against everything that wanted to kill them had shaped humans into something that the galaxy had never encountered before. And now all of that inherited violence was waking up inside Alara Vance. Commander Vorath charged toward her with the force of a runaway shuttle, his forearms spread wide to grab and crush and tear. Time seemed to slow down as Alara's old brain took control. She watched his leading foot hit the ground and calculated the angle of his momentum. She watched his upper right arm reach toward her and saw the opening that his aggressive posture created. She felt her own body shift its weight onto her back foot in preparation for what came next. Instead of running away or freezing in terror, Alara did something that violated every instinct of self-preservation. She stepped forward, directly into the path of the charging berserker. Her movement was explosive, a single burst of speed that carried her inside the reach of his grabbing arms before they could close around her. She twisted her hips and dropped her center of gravity low, lower than any species with a different skeletal structure could manage. Her shoulder drove into his midsection, just below where his forearms connected to his torso. Her right hand grabbed his leading wrist with a grip that had been trained through thousands of repetitions in her grandfather's dojo. Her left hand gripped the fabric of his uniform near his collar. And then she pulled and rotated with every ounce of strength in her small human body. The technique was called Ippon Age in the language of Earth, a shoulder throw that had been perfected over centuries of martial study. It used the opponent's own momentum against them, redirecting their force through a circular motion that sent them flying over the thrower's hip. It was a technique designed by humans to defeat larger and stronger opponents, a weapon of the weak against the powerful. Commander Varad's feet left the ground. 300 pounds of Kethvari berserker rose into the air, carried by the physics of leverage and rotation that cared nothing for size or strength or reputation. He flew over Alara's shoulder in a graceful arc that seemed to happen in slow motion, his massive body rotating through the air like a leaf caught in a hurricane. And then he hit the deck with a crash that shook the entire trauma bay. The impact was tremendous, sending tremors through the floor plating that knocked medical equipment off shelves and caused the lights to flicker. Vorad's back slammed into the ground with enough force to dent the metal beneath him. But Alara was not finished because her grandfather had taught her that throwing an opponent was only the first half of the technique. Before Vorath could recover, before his berserker brain could process what had happened, she transitioned into a pin that had been developed to control opponents on the ground. Her knee drove into his primary shoulder, pressing down with all her weight concentrated on a single point. Her hands locked around his leading wrist in a joint lock that threatened to hyperextend his elbow if he struggled. It was not strength that held him there, but leverage and position. The same principles that allowed a small wrench to loosen a bolt that bare hands could never move. The room was absolutely silent. Torvin stood frozen with all four arms hanging limp at her sides, her stone-carved face showing an expression of complete disbelief that would have been comical in any other situation. Dr. Pellion had managed to pull himself into a sitting position against the shattered medical cabinet, and he was staring at Alara with his large, watery eyes stretched wider than she had ever seen them. Other staff members had gathered at the doorway, drawn by the sounds of combat, and they watched with their mouths hanging open as the small human girl held down the most dangerous warrior on the station. Commander Vorath struggled beneath her, his muscles straining against the joint lock, but every movement only increased the pressure on his trapped arm. His black eyes were flickering now, flashes of amber breaking through the darkness as his higher brain fought to regain control from the berserker instinct. "Commander Vorath," Alara said in a voice that was somehow steady despite everything. "Can you hear me?" A growl rumbled from his chest, but it was weaker now, less primal. "You are in the emergency ward of Nexus Station 7, she continued. "You were injured in battle, and you entered a berserker state during surgery, but you are safe now, and no one is going to hurt you." The amber in his eyes grew stronger, pushing back the black. "I need you to breathe," Alara said. "Just breathe and let your body remember that the fight is over." Vorath's massive chest heaved as he drew in a long, shuddering breath. The tension in his muscles began to fade. His eyes cleared completely, the black disappearing like shadows before the dawn, and he stared up at the ceiling with an expression of profound confusion. "What happened?" He rasped in a voice that sounded broken. "Where am I? And why is there a human sitting on my shoulder?" Alara allowed herself a small smile despite the sweat dripping down her face and the trembling in her muscles that she could no longer hide. "You had a bad reaction to the surgery," she explained. "But everything is under control now." She maintained the pin for another few seconds, just to make sure, and then slowly released her grip and stood up on legs that felt like they might collapse at any moment. Commander Vorath lay on the ground and stared at her with all three of his amber eyes. And for the first time since she had arrived on this station, an alien was looking at her with something other than contempt. It looked almost like respect. The silence in the trauma bay stretched on for what felt like an eternity, broken only by the soft hum of medical equipment and the distant wail of alarms that no one had thought to turn off. Alara stood over Commander Vorath with her hands shaking and her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The adrenaline that had carried her through the last few minutes was beginning to fade, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion that made her want to collapse. But she could not collapse, not yet, because there was still work to be done. "Dr. Pellion," she called out while forcing her voice to remain steady. "Are you injured?" The elderly physician pulled himself to his feet with a groan. One thin hand pressed against his ribs where Commander Vorath had struck him. "Bruised but functional," he replied in a voice filled with wonder. "Human, how did you do what I just witnessed?" Alara shook her head because she did not have a good answer to that question. "Can you finish the surgery?" she asked instead. The shrapnel is still in his chest. Dr. Pelion blinked, as if he had forgotten about the fragments that had started this entire disaster. And then he nodded and began gathering his scattered instruments with trembling hands. Commander Vorath had not moved from his position on the floor. He lay there staring up at Alara with an expression she could not read, his forearms spread out beside him like a warrior accepting defeat on an ancient battlefield. "Commander," Alara said as she knelt beside him, "we still need to remove the shrapnel from your thorax, and I strongly recommend that you accept sedation this time." A sound emerged from Vorath's throat that might have been a laugh or might have been a growl of frustration. "You have earned the right to give me orders, small human," he said in a voice that was quieter than before. "I will accept whatever treatment you recommend." Security finally arrived in the form of 6 armed officers who burst through the doors with weapons drawn, ready to face the berserker that had been reported. They found instead a calm trauma bay, an elderly doctor preparing for surgery, and a small human girl helping the station's most dangerous warrior back onto the operating table. "Stand down," Torvin ordered the security team with a wave of her upper arms. "The situation has been resolved." The lead security officer, a tall Corvian with feathers the color of midnight, looked around the room with obvious confusion. "How?" he asked. "We received reports of a Kethvari berserker, and the response time for such incidents is typically measured in casualties." Torvin pointed one of her lower arms at Alara without taking her eyes off the human. "Ask her," the head nurse said. Alara ignored the stares and focused on her patient, helping Dr. Pelion prepare the sedation that Commander Vorath had finally agreed to accept. "This will make you sleep," she explained as she administered the injection. "When you wake up, the shrapnel will be gone and you will feel much better." Vorath's 3 amber eyes were already growing heavy, but he managed to focus on Alara's face one last time before the sedation took hold. "What are you called, small warrior?" he asked, Alara Vance. "I will remember that name," he murmured as his eyes closed. "The galaxy will remember that name." The surgery took 2 hours and went smoothly without any further complications. Dr. Pelion removed 7 fragments of shrapnel from the commander's thorax while Alara assisted with steady hands that had finally stopped shaking. When it was finished and Vorath was resting peacefully in recovery, Alara stepped out of the trauma bay and found herself facing a crowd of staff members who had gathered in the corridor. They stared at her with expressions ranging from disbelief to awe to something that looked almost like fear. And Alara realized that she had no idea what to say to any of them. Torvin pushed through the crowd and stood before her, all 4 arms crossed in front of her chest, in a posture that Alara had learned to associate with serious conversation. "Human," the head nurse said in her rumbling voice. "I have served in medical facilities across 17 star systems. I have seen many things that I thought were impossible." Alara waited for whatever was coming next. "I have never seen a prey species defeat a Kethvari in combat," Torvin continued. "I did not believe it could be done, and I especially did not believe it could be done by someone who weighs less than one of his arms." "I was trained," Alara said simply. "My grandfather taught me." "Your grandfather must have been a formidable warrior." Alara smiled at the memory of the old man who had spent his weekends teaching her how to fall without getting hurt and how to turn an opponent's strength against them. "He was a retired schoolteacher," she replied. "He ran a small martial arts dojo in his basement and charged $10 a lesson." Torvin made a sound that might have been confusion or might have been disbelief. "You learned to defeat the galaxy's greatest warriors from a retired schoolteacher?" she asked. "Humans have been fighting each other for a very long time," Alara explained. "We got quite good at it." The crowd parted to let her pass as she walked toward the supply room to restock the equipment that had been destroyed during the incident. She could feel their eyes on her back, could hear them whispering to each other in languages she did not understand. But for the first time since arriving on Nexus Station 7, she did not feel invisible. That night she returned to her quarters and sat on her narrow bed and stared at her hands as if seeing them for the first time. These hands had just done something that every other species in the galaxy considered impossible. Her communicator chirped with an incoming message, and she opened it to find a formal notice from Station Command. They wanted to interview her about the incident, to understand what had happened and how she had managed to subdue the Berserker. Below that notice was another message, this one from the Galactic Union's Combat Studies Division. They had received preliminary reports and were requesting access to the security footage for analysis. And below, that was a message from someone she did not recognize, a formal invitation written in the ceremonial language of the Kethvari people. Alara read the invitation 3 times before she fully understood what it was saying. A Kethvari martial arts academy had heard rumors of what she had done, and they were inviting her to visit their training facility to demonstrate a Death World combat techniques for their senior instructors. She put down the communicator and laughed softly to herself in the darkness of her quarters. 3 weeks ago, she had been the reject that nobody wanted, the small soft human who was expected to fail. Now the galaxy was beginning to pay attention. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a very long while, she was actually looking forward to finding out. The security footage spread across the galactic networks faster than anyone could have predicted, jumping from station to station and system to system like a wildfire burning through dry grass. Within 3 days of the incident, Ilara's face had been viewed by billions of beings across a dozen different species, and her name had become the subject of countless discussions in military academies and research facilities and drinking establishments throughout known space. She tried to ignore the attention and focus on her work, but that became increasingly difficult when patients started requesting her specifically, and colleagues, who had once ignored her, began seeking her out for conversation. Is it true that humans can run without stopping for entire days? A young Silene nurse asked her during a quiet moment in the ward. Some humans can, Ilara replied. We evolved as persistent hunters, chasing prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. That is terrifying, the nurse said, with what might have been admiration in her crystalline voice. Commander Vorath recovered from his surgery within a week, his Kethvari physiology healing the wounds with remarkable speed. He was cleared for discharge, but he did not immediately leave the station. Instead, he remained in the recovery ward, watching Ilara work through half-lidded eyes and saying very little to anyone who tried to speak with him. The other staff members were nervous about having him there, a living reminder of how close they had all come to disaster, but Ilara found that she did not mind his presence. There was something almost peaceful about the way he observed her, like a predator that had decided she was not prey. 1 week after the incident, a delegation from the Galactic Union arrived to conduct their official investigation. They interviewed everyone who had witnessed the event, reviewed the security footage frame by frame, and asked Ilara to demonstrate the technique she had used. She threw a training dummy across the interview room while 3 admirals watched with expressions of intense fascination. Remarkable, the lead admiral said, a silver-scaled Corvian with medals covering her chest. The Kethvari have long been considered undefeatable in close combat, and yet you managed to neutralize one of their most decorated officers with a technique that appears to rely entirely on leverage and positioning. Humans learned a long time ago that we would never be the biggest or the strongest, Ilara explained. So we developed ways to fight that did not require us to be either. Your species has only been part of the galactic community for 60 years, another admiral observed. We are still learning what you are capable of. The investigation concluded with a commendation for Ilara's actions and a recommendation that human close combat techniques be studied for potential integration into Galactic Union training programs. She declined the offer to transfer to a prestigious military academy and chose instead to remain at Nexus Station 7. This was where she had been assigned, and this was where she would stay. The attention faded eventually, as attention always does, and life at the station returned to something resembling normal. Alara continued to work her shifts in the emergency ward, treating patients and restocking supplies and slowly earning the respect of colleagues who had once dismissed her. Torvin stopped calling her human and started calling her Vance, which was apparently a significant promotion in Tarvaxian culture. Dr. Pellion admitted that her practical skills were exceptional and began including her in complex procedures that he would never have trusted her with before. And late one night cycle, nearly a month after the incident, Alara heard a knock at the door of the emergency ward. She opened it to find Commander Vorath standing in the corridor, his massive form barely fitting in the space between the walls. He was dressed in civilian clothes rather than his military uniform, and he carried a bottle of something amber-colored in one of his 4 hands. "May I enter?" he asked in his grinding rock's voice. Alara stepped aside and let him through, watching as he moved carefully between the beds to avoid disturbing the sleeping patients. For all his size and strength, he could be surprisingly gentle when he chose to be. They sat in the small break room at the back of the ward, 2 beings from different worlds, sharing a space that felt strangely comfortable, despite how unlikely it was. Vorath poured 2 glasses of the amber liquid and pushed one toward Alara with his lower right hand. "On my world," he said slowly, as if the words were difficult for him to speak. "When a warrior spares your life after defeating you, you owe them a debt that can never truly be repaid." Alara looked at the glass, but did not pick it up. "I did not defeat you," she said. "I stopped you from hurting people while you were not in control of yourself, and that is different." "Is it?" Vorath asked with something that might have been amusement in his amber eyes. "I was in my berserker state, the most dangerous condition a Kethvari can experience, and you put me on the ground as if I were a child throwing a tantrum. You were injured and in pain." "I have been injured and in pain many times," Vorath replied. "No one has ever stopped me before." He picked up his own glass and took a long drink, then set it down with a heavy thunk. "I have thought about what happened for many weeks now," he continued. "I have analyzed the footage and consulted with combat experts and tried to understand how something that should have been impossible actually occurred." "And what conclusion did you reach?" Alara asked. Vorath was silent for a moment, his 3 eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her want to look away. "I concluded that my people have made a serious error in judgment," he finally said. "We looked at humans and saw small, soft creatures with no natural weapons, and we assumed that meant you were weak." He leaned forward, and his voice dropped to something almost like a whisper. "We forgot to ask why you had no natural weapons," he said. "We forgot to consider that perhaps you did not need them because you had developed something far more dangerous." Alara finally picked up her glass and raised it toward him. "On my world," she said with a small smile, "when someone brings you a drink and has a conversation with you, we just call it making a new friend." Vorath made that sound again that might have been a laugh. "Friends?" he repeated as if tasting the word. "I do not have many of those." "Well, now you have one more." They touched glasses and drank together, the small human and the giant warrior, 2 people who had found common ground in the most unlikely of circumstances. "The galaxy has no idea what it invited to the table when it welcomed humans to the stars," Vorath said as he stood to leave. "But I think they are beginning to learn." Alara watched him go, this massive creature who could crush her with one hand, but who had instead chosen to share a drink and call her friend. She thought about her grandfather and his tiny dojo, about the techniques he had taught her that came from centuries of human conflict, about the incredible journey that had brought her from a small planet called Earth to this moment on the edge of known space. The galaxy was vast and full of wonders and dangers beyond counting, but humans had faced dangers before and survived. They had crawled out of caves and crossed oceans and reached for the stars, with nothing but stubborn determination and the refusal to ever give up. Whatever came next, Alara knew that she would face it the same way her ancestors had faced every challenge before her. She would stand her ground, and she would not break. That was what it meant to be human.